Welcome to another LA Lawman Seminar. This morning's guest speaker is Martin J., also known as Red Beckman. Red started in 1976 a major broadcast campaign across the state of Montana. The purpose was to begin educating citizens, honest politicians, judges, and even IRS agents. Because of his efforts, people who were fully informed of jury procedures were put on the jury, and proper verdicts began to be rendered. This was on the trial and grand juries, which you will be finding more out today. The ultimate result was that IRS supervisors began resigning. This was because 4 out of every 5 decisions were being decided in the favor of we the people. Red has authored over a dozen books and pamphlets, and in short, he has put the IRS on their heels. Please welcome Martin J. Red Beckman.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you. Back a couple of 100 years ago, we had some people in this country that didn't particularly like the way their government was functioning. And they decided they wouldn't pay any more taxes, and they wouldn't follow the government's commandments, you might say. And of course, this was old King George III over there in England. He was the head of the government of that day. And we had 13 colonies at that time in this country. And those people, they were strong individuals. They recognized that government had become too powerful, that government was trying to plunder their wealth, and they decided that they didn't like having their wealth plundered. They didn't like having to pay too much of their income, their production, going to taxes. And of course, they called them patriots back then. And King George III, he called them tax protesters. Well, here we are, a little over 200 years later, and we have a government in this country, and they are calling people like me tax protesters. And somehow or other, I don't mind that at all. I wear that badge, that label, I wear it as a badge of honor, because it puts me up in a class where I really don't feel like I belong, but it just kind of makes me feel like I'm rubbing shoulders with fellas like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, the Adams fellas up there in the Boston area, Patrick Henry, and those kind of people, because King George called them tax protesters. And so here we are. We have a government today that is calling people like myself a tax protester. And so I wear that label with a great deal of pride, because I think it puts me in a pretty good class of people. I sure don't want to be put into the class of people that are out here bowing down to all of the edicts that are being handed down by our national, our state, our county, and our city governments. I think it's time that we have a stirring in this country, and we are having that stirring at this very moment in this country. The founders, when they created the Declaration of Independence, they made a statement there that is fitting for today. They said, "All experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they have become accustomed." Back when I became very active in this movement in this country, there weren't too many people out there that felt that they had suffered enough. I was rather lonesome. But today, I'm not lonesome anymore, because I find that there are a lot of my countrymen out there who have come to the point where they have suffered enough and they want to make some changes. And it is happening all over this nation. Now, back about 10 years ago, I wrote a book that I put a title on it, and I called it Do Unto the IRS as They Would Do Unto You. And inside the front cover, I put this comment. I said this: everyone should pay their fair share of taxes. A nation that allows its tax consumers to decide what is a fair share will destroy productivity, then destroy itself. We have trusted government too much in this country. We have trusted our public servants to determine what is a fair share. And we find that now the public servants say that over 50% of what we produce is a fair share. Now, a little over 200 years ago, when we had the tax protesters there that brought about the War of Independence and the independence of this great nation, when that happened, King George III was taxing the people at a rate of 14%. And the people rebelled and said, no, we will not tolerate that rate of taxation. Today it is over 50% in this country, and I believe that it is time that we react, and react very positively. Now, there are two ways that you can react in a situation such as this. You can react with violence, the guns and the bombs and all of this, and the blood and the gore that goes with a war of independence. You can go that route. But as I have said many times across this nation, and you'll find it in my books, I say that a bloody revolution is a sign of failure. It is a sign of failure on the part of government. It's a sign of failure on the part of the people. Because we in this country at this point in time have access to a solution that is orderly, that is proper, that is legal, it is lawful, and it is a solution that is right at our fingertips. It is there, and it is a solution that was given to us, put into our form of government, so that we could have access to it at a time like we have in this nation right now. The government of the United States today, the federal government in Washington, D.C., has become a monster. And that's what this critter right here is all about. Our state governments have become monsters. They are out here determining what is a fair share. They are putting rules and regulations and acts and laws and statutes on our backs at a rate that we just cannot tolerate anymore. That problem has come right on down to our county level. That problem has come right down to our city level. And so I have this visual aid here, and this represents government in this country at all levels. We the people were supposed to be up here above our government. We were to have government that would serve rather than master the people. It was to be a government of, by, and for the people. But today, the government is free, and we the people are servants. We are serfs. We are out here controlled rather than controlling government. Now, as I have said many, many times, there are only two kinds of government, just two. The political scientists, they tell us, oh, there's socialism and there's Nazism and fascism and monarchies and democracies and republics and all of that. But just forget all of that garbage, all of that complexity that they love to build into this system to confuse people. There are only two kinds of government. You have people in control of government, or you have government in control of people. You either have the people down here underneath government, or you are going to have people up here above government. We were given a system back there 200 years ago when the Constitution for the United States of America was ratified. We were given a system whereby we the people were up here. Over the years, we have allowed this monster to lower our status, put us down here, and of course when we're down here, we're not free, but the government is free. This monster is free out here. All across this nation, however, at this point you will find that people are saying, hey, The monster is out of control. We have to bring it back. And in state after state after state, we now have initiative process going on, and people are saying, they're signing petitions, and they're saying, we will not let our legislators put another tax on us without our consent at the ballot box. This is a move in the right direction. However, this does not cure the problem that we have at the national level. So we have to put our finger on the solution of how we control the government at the national level. I am absolutely confident that if we can control the government at the national level, we will be able to control it at the state, the county, and the city level without any problem. So I am going to be talking basically about how we can control the government, our government in this nation right now, the national government, the federal government as they call it. We can control it very simple. Now, there's a lot of people out there that are talking about different areas. They're talking about the problem with the Federal Reserve Bank situation, the fractional banking. It is a serious problem. They're talking about all of the things that, the rules and the regulations that are put into the system to control us. And they're talking about these, they're researching the problem, they're digging out the truth. Now, we need a solution that is very simple. We need a solution that we can convey to Joe Sixpack out there and his family. We have to understand and remember the fact that all of us, almost without exception, are victims of a government school system. The comprehension level of the average American out there is not up to a point where they can understand any complex situation or solution. So we have to talk about a very simple solution. We have to reach these people at their level. We have to communicate with them at their level. And what I am going to go through here with these visual aids of mine is very simple. There is nothing complex about it. And I want to convey to my fellow American out there, my countrymen, the fact that we have a solution that is an orderly solution, a solution that will work. It takes the power away from this monster and puts the people up here and puts the people back in control. Now, when we went to the government school, when we were students in the government school, they had a class in our high school years. They had a class, in the younger generation here, they had a class called government. When I went to high school, they called it civics. They taught us what the government wanted us to believe about how the system was designed to function. That's what we were taught. We have to recognize that government does not want us to know how to control government. They do not want us to know that we, the people, have power. It is our power that government has been utilizing to run up this tremendous, well, I guess it's multi-trillion-dollar debt. They've used our power to do all kinds of things to control we the people. Now, when we went to that government school, they taught us that, I better put that down here, and I'll take this one out of the way. They said that we control the monster, the governments, local, state, federal. They said we control it with our vote on election day, right? They said you elect the president every 4 years, you elect your congressmen and your senators, and that is how you control government. They say your representatives, they will represent you and they will control the monster. Well, who is it that has been putting all of these taxes and rules and regulations on it? It's our representatives, isn't it? Because we have found that we elect people to Congress, we elect people to the Senate, we elect a president, and they violate their campaign promises. They say they're going to balance the budget, and instead of balancing the budget, they give us bigger deficits. So we have to put more bars on the cage. And so we're going to put some bars on this cage, the bars that really control government. The grand jury. They didn't teach us about the grand jury and how that the grand jury is put into our system, was put into our system back there to control the monster. The trial jury. They didn't tell us that that is our third vote in the system. You notice what I said, the third vote? They didn't teach us in that government school that we have a three-vote political system. You have to be a registered voter to vote on election day for the congressmen and senators and presidents. You have to be a registered voter to get called for grand jury duty because you're going to vote. You're going to vote here and you're going to vote here, and you have to be a registered voter to get called for that federal trial, that petit jury duty. Now, we have here a three-vote system, and this is what the founders gave us back there when they ratified the Constitution for the United States of America, when they had declared their independence from King George III and his government. And so what has happened here is we, the people, using all three of our votes, we have put ourselves up here. Now, we cannot expect our representatives in Congress, our senators, and our President of the United States to put us up here. There's only one way that we can get ourselves, put ourselves from here up to here. And the only way we can do that is by exercising this vote here, the grand jury vote, and the trial jury vote. Now, what I'm talking about here is something that Joe Sixpack out there, when he watches this television program, he can understand what I'm saying. On this grand jury, the grand jury, they can use their votes to investigate the criminal activity of Internal Revenue Service agents. You say, well, they must have some law. No, they don't have a law. And what they are doing is they are out here using fear against the American people. Now, I'm going to give you an example. A couple of years ago, just before April 15th, there was a Congressional Oversight Committee that had hearings on IRS abuse. IRS abuse, Internal Revenue Service abuse. And there was a lady that was invited to come and testify before that committee, and she was a widow woman from down in the eastern coastline there, North Carolina, as I remember. And she was a widow woman because of the Internal Revenue Service. And she testified how that the Internal Revenue Service had put a monstrous big assessment against her and her husband. They seized their bank account, they tied up their property, all of their assets were tied up, and they had no resources whatever with which to hire competent counsel to try to unravel this mess that was created by Internal Revenue Service employees. She came home one day and she found a note from her husband. He says, "You will find my body in the back lot." He says, "I'm going to commit suicide. You are to take the insurance money, hire the competent counsel that you need to unravel this mess, and you'll get it all straightened out." She found his body in the back lot, just as he said. She took the insurance money, hired competent counsel, and they were able to prove that these two people, this man and wife, did not owe the IRS one single dime. They were not tax protesters. They were targeted by the IRS, and they were abused by the IRS, and this man committed suicide, and I call it murder by suicide. Those IRS agents are still out there running loose in this country. They are out there, and when they're out there doing their thing, this monster is loose. This monster is out there terrorizing more people because the grand jury in particular in that location. Now, this was on national television, these hearings before the Congressional Oversight Committee. The grand jury, federal grand jury in that area, it was their responsibility. They should have immediately subpoenaed the district director of the Internal Revenue Service. They should have gotten the names of the IRS agents that were responsible. And they should have investigated, and they should have indicted, and those people should have gone to jail. But the grand jury was not functioning. You can talk about the Federal Reserve Bank scam and all of those different scams out there in government, but until we get these registered voters out there to understand their power, their responsibility, their duty on the grand juries, we are not going to see the solutions. We're not going to see the change that we must see. There is a widow woman in North Carolina. Her husband was murdered by the government, agents of the government, and they are free. They are not being prosecuted because Joe Sixpack, sitting on the grand jury, his wife sitting on the grand jury, does not understand her responsibility or her duty. They do not understand what the grand jury is all about because they have never been taught. The government doesn't want you to know. The IRS doesn't want you to know. The IRS, they do not want you to know the truth. Now, I have a copy of one of their manuals. This is an IRS manual that has been out a number of years. This is just a copy of it. In the very beginning of it, there's a foreword. The foreword for this manual was written by the Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service. And here's what he says in the foreword, the very first line. Our tax system is based on individual self-assessment and voluntary compliance. Voluntary compliance? We all know what the word voluntary means. But people are not volunteering in this country to file income tax returns. They are filing because of coercion. They're filing because of fear. They're filing because we have a government that has to use fear and intimidation to be able to function. Now, here's the part that really bothered me the most when I first read this. The last paragraph. The material contained in this handbook is confidential in character. It must not, under any circumstances, be made available to persons outside of the service. This is a public servant, ladies and gentlemen, who is saying, well, I'm going to hide something from my masters. I'm going to hide something. I'm going to keep my master in the dark. What is this? This is an unfaithful servant, isn't it? This is an employee who should not be your employee. This is an employee that should be fired because this employee is violating your trust and your confidence. Now, why would they say that this book should not get into the hands of anyone outside of the IRS? This is what it says in this one section, books and records of an individual. An individual taxpayer may refuse to exhibit his books and records for examination on the ground that compelling him to do so might violate his right against illegal search and seizure under the Fifth Amendment. No, I got that wrong. I got on the wrong line. That compelling him to do so might violate his right against self-incrimination under the Fifth Amendment and constitute an illegal search and seizure under the Fourth Amendment. What is this? This is the Fourth and Fifth Amendment they're talking about. That's part of our great Bill of Rights, isn't it? I just turned the page here And here's a section on constitutional law. It says constitutional protections are provided in the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendments. They know. They don't want us to know, do they? We have to communicate with Joe Sixpack out here. We have to get to him and educate him, inform him, get the truth to him. The IRS does not want anyone outside of the service to see this book, because this book has the truth in it. And they cannot function if you know the truth. Now, instead of them giving you this little manual to read with your income tax return, your 1040, they give you a little pamphlet, don't they? A little booklet. Every year they send out the 1040s, and they give every taxpayer this little booklet of instructions. Now, they want you to read that. The reason they want you to read that is because they are not telling you the truth in that pamphlet. This one has the truth, so they don't want you to read it. So with that, we'll take that quick break here for a tape change, and we'll go on from there. I have talked about this. Now I'm going to talk on this side over here with my visual aid over here. I believe that most Americans will agree with me that our tax-consuming public servants lied to us about Pearl Harbor. I think most Americans would agree that they lied to us about Korea. They lied about Vietnam. They didn't tell us the truth about the energy shortage. They didn't tell us the truth. They haven't told us the truth about Social Security. We never had all of the covers taken off of the Watergate scandal. We were never told the truth about the Kennedy assassination. And I am absolutely convinced that if we go back and check the record, we will find that our public servants, our tax-consuming public servants, have not told us the truth on any major story or happening in this century. Go back to 1900 and start in 1900 and check the major stories that have happened, and I believe that if you will research those stories, you will find that the American people were not told the truth. Now, that's a pretty poor track record for truth. Now, one of the major lies that was taught to the American people came about through our government school system. In the government school system, they taught us, as I said before, they taught us about how the government was supposed to function, at least from the government point of view. And one of the things that they taught us was that our form of government is a democracy where the majority rules. A majority rule democracy, and we can rarely turn on the television news, but what we see some politician talking about our democracy, or they're talking about over in Russia how their President Yeltsin is trying to put together a democracy. Now, every place that we have tried to go in and create a democracy, those people have always had trouble. They say we have to protect this democracy thing, and they said we went into Vietnam and to help those people create a democracy over there, and what we did was create a tremendous mess. A lot of our good young American blood was shed over there on that foreign soil. It seems like we're not doing too well over in Somalia, and we're not doing too well in Haiti. We didn't do too well down in San Salvador. And every place we've gone trying to instill a democracy, we end up with chaos. Well, the reason for that is very simple, because a democracy has never worked in all of history. It has been tried, and it has been proven a failure every time that it has been tried, and it is a failure in this country, but they are still teaching the students in our schools, our government schools, that we have a democracy. Now, a democracy is a system that will not work. And I am here to explain to you why it won't work. And the way I do that is this. Most of you have heard the term pecking order. The biologists, they went out in the barnyard and they watched the chickens in the barnyard, and they came to the conclusion that every flock of chickens had a chicken that was dominating the entire flock. And each chicken in that society had its proper position. Each chicken knew where it belonged in that chicken society. Every herd of cows I've had coming from Montana and having a few cows of my own, I have recognized the fact that in every herd of cows you will have a boss cow, a dominant critter in that herd of cows. Now, human societies are no different. In every governmental society on the face of the earth, you will find that there is a pecking order. Somebody is at the top and somebody's at the bottom, and then there are those in between. The military, it doesn't make any difference what military you're talking about, has a pecking order, only they call it the chain of command. And when you go into the military, they teach you the chain of command. That's probably the first thing you're going to learn when you go into the military. And you're going to be taught very specifically that as a new recruit, you have no power. The power is all up the ladder. And so the democracy form of government will have a pecking order. And we must understand that pecking order if we're going to understand how our system was designed to function 200 years ago. The pecking order in a majority rule democracy is here. You will notice, of course, I have the pecking order over here in a constitutional republic, which is our lawful form of government. The founders of this country, the word democracy was a dirty word in their vocabulary. Thomas Paine, the great motivator of the American War of Independence, he said, a democracy is the vilest form of government there is. James Madison, who is known as the father of our U.S. Constitution, he said a democracy will lead to the loss of property rights. It will lead to chaos. They knew that a democracy would not work, and they tried to warn us about the dangers of a democracy. But here we are 200 years later, and our government controls the schools, and they're teaching that we have a democracy. Thomas Paine must be spinning in his grave, because we today in this country have a vile form of government. What does that word vile mean? Well, I think the word evil probably is more fitting, and we probably understand that a little better today if we say we have an evil government. Now, the pecking order. Right at the top in the pecking order here in this system, we have Group X. I will explain who Group X is after I go through the rest of the list, because no one has ever told us anything about there being a Group X up there at the very top in our political system. They taught us that the majority controlled the government with their vote on election day. This vote right here. They said that the majority controls the government. The government then, of course, controls the public servants. They create the case and the statute law. The statute law, of course, creates the corporations. And guess who's on the bottom in this democratic system? We, the people, as individuals, are on the bottom. We are powerless today in the system if you are operating under the rules and the teaching that was given to you in the government school. You are powerless if you're not using your grand jury vote and your trial jury vote to control that monster. Most Americans find themselves right here on the bottom today. They go to the polls on election day, and they are confronted with a ballot that has two evils. Two evils. You've got two candidates running for the same office, and they're both evil, and you try to figure out which is the lesser of two evils, right? And you walk out of those polls after you have cast your ballot, and you are frustrated, and you feel absolutely powerless. The reason is you're on the bottom. That registered voter that understands his jury, his grand jury and his jury power, he's not that concerned, because he knows that if he gets on that grand jury or on that trial jury, he can make his vote count. He has some power because he has knowledge. What is knowledge? Knowledge is truth stored in the mind. If you have lies stored in the mind, you don't have any knowledge, do you? You have degrees. You perhaps have all kinds of letters behind your name. PhD, perhaps. But if it was the lies you believed that qualified you for that PhD, you don't have knowledge. These people down here don't have knowledge. They have believed the lie, and they believe that their only power is that one vote on election day. Group X, who are they? Every Monday morning we have 12 bankers that go back to Washington, D.C. These 12 bankers are unelected. They never run for office. You will never see their names on a ballot. You are not going to have any choice as to who they are. They are unknown. And they will remain unknown because they don't want you to know who they are. And they don't want you to understand how much power they have because they control the majority. We go back to 1979, October of 79. Jimmy Carter is towards the end of his 4-year term as President of the United States. He has not announced for re-election. However, everyone in this country knows that he will run for re-election. Ronald Reagan has been running since 1976 for the Republican nomination in 1980. These bankers, this group right here, 12, they have decided that Jimmy Carter is not going to have a second 4-year term in the White House. They have decided that it is going to be Ronald Reagan who will be the next president of the United States. And so they started raising the interest rates in October of 1979. Every time the interest rates went up a point or a half a point, you had another million or so of our countrymen who were out of a job. Steel workers, auto workers, loggers, sawmillers, carpenters, plumbers, electricians, so many of these people were out of work, and we had what they called a recession. And interest rates went all the way up to 20%, and who got blamed for it? Was it Group X that was blamed for all of that? No. Nobody blamed them. They all blamed Jimmy Carter. And I don't think Jimmy Carter even knew what had happened to him. It's a sure thing he didn't win a second term in the White House, because we were manipulated in this country. Now, I wasn't manipulated. I'm going to have to do a little bragging here. I was not manipulated because I knew that what was going to happen was, where Jimmy Carter had deficits running 60 to 70 billion, I knew that we were going to have deficits running in the 200 billion plus range. In other words, these bankers were going to be able to loan over 3 times as much to the government. The deficits were going to be tripled, and I knew that was going to happen even if Ronald Reagan was promising the American people out on the campaign trail that he was going to balance the budget. You remember that. He said he was going to balance the budget. And I was telling people out here, I said, we're going to get the biggest deficits we've ever seen in this nation. And people thought I was nuts. But you see, time goes on by, and I was right. I was correct. Now, let's go over here to the pecking order in this constitutional republic, the form of government that the founders gave us back there with the Constitution for the United States of America. They had that constitutional convention back there in 1787. By 1791, December of 1791, we had the Constitution ratified, and we had the Bill of Rights. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution had been ratified by the states. We had an independent nation. It was a nation of independent sovereign states. Now, I won't get into that part of it, but here was the pecking order in the system that they gave us at that point in time. They put God, our Creator, at the very top. Go back and read the Declaration of Independence, and they talk about nature's God. Who are they talking about? They're talking about a Creator God. Now, they put the individual next in line. God didn't create this system. It was people. We the people created the system. You'll notice that the Constitution is below we the people. These individuals, that's what we make up as we the people. And they wrote the Constitution. We're not below the Constitution. I don't have any constitutional rights. My rights are inalienable or unalienable, whichever term you want to use, because they came from my Creator. And the founders understood that so very, very well. And so here we are here, and so now we have written a law called the Constitution for the United States of America. Not the Constitution of the United States. It is the Constitution for the United States of America. The United States, the municipal corporation in the District of Columbia, they have their Constitution. But the Constitution that is supposed to govern them is this Constitution right here, written by we the people. And that Constitution, of course, created the government, created the public servants. These public servants create the statute law. Case law doesn't fit over here in this system at all. Over here, it's case law that governs this nation today. And the corporation is on the bottom, created by the statute law. Now, if in that government class, when we went to high school, if they had put the contrast, if they had put these two pecking orders up on the blackboard in front of our class, and then said, now class, which system do you prefer to live under? Do you want to live over here in this system where you're up here at the top, where you're above the Constitution? Or do you want to be over here in this system where you're on the bottom and there is no Constitution at all here? The Constitution means nothing in this system here. The Congress of the United States, they wrote a law that's called the Anti-Injunction Act that says that if the IRS puts a high assessment against you, you have to pay that money, you have to pay that assessment before you can have access to the courts. Well, the Fifth Amendment says you are guaranteed the right to due process, right? Well, how come they can do that? How come the Supreme Court says it's constitutional? Well, the Supreme Court, they say, we control. We are the ones that tell you what the Constitution means. Now, the difference, you see, if we take these two bars off this cage right here, here's your democracy, and the people are down here. This is your democracy, but we don't want that. I'm sure that the classrooms across this country, if they had been given the choice of which system they wanted to live under, what form of government they would like to live under, they would not have taken a choice that would make this monster, or let this monster be free out here in our midst. The people, if we had had this choice between the two systems, this would have been our choice. Now, I'm going to go to a little more detail here in my charts. Remember the pecking order, because the pecking order is here. Now, we want to communicate with our fellow Americans, with our countrymen. We want to communicate this so that they can help us to change this system, to put these bars back up here on this cage where they belong. To do that, we have to know what we're talking about. We have to understand the system ourselves. Now, you don't have to go back to college for another semester or another term. When this 2 hours is over, you will understand. You will understand how to communicate with your fellow American out there and how to bring back our lawful system. This is all in its proper order, everything, from top to bottom. We have God and God's law up here at the top. We have the laws of common sense. Now, common sense tells us that if you want to live in an orderly society, you have to have justice. And there's only one way that you can have justice in a system, and that is if you have truth. The professors out here in our universities and colleges are telling our kids, the students, that truth is an ambiguous term. I disagree. I believe that those people need to be put out of work. I believe that those people need to go back to school and learn some very basic facts. Without truth, if truth is an ambiguous term, you don't have justice. We don't have justice in our nation today at this point in time because of this education process where they're telling us and teaching us this garbage. Laws of common sense tell us that truth is the basic ingredient that you must have in place to have an orderly society. Truth, justice, morality, respect for life, honesty, integrity. These are the ingredients of an orderly society. Now, the founders said we're going to have a government of law, not men. If you're going to have a government of law, you must have a law governing language. You must have a discipline of language. You must have your words meaning, having good, solid, stable meanings, definitions. Remember, I showed you that tax audit guide where the commissioner of the IRS said our tax system is based on voluntary assessment and voluntary compliance. The word voluntary. There isn't anyone here. There won't be anybody in our audience, TV audience, that will not be able to give us a definition of what the word voluntary means. It's a free will act. There can be no compulsion. It is not mandatory. It is not required. But our courts, our judges in our courts, and our prosecutors in our courts are saying you must volunteer or you go to jail. That is a violation of the laws of grammar, improper use of words, of language. It is so vital. Now, I call these the higher laws up here. These are higher laws, and here we are, the individual, we the people, here we're at this level. These are the laws which govern us. These are the laws that we use in our everyday living. If we're a businessman, we don't carry a bunch of law books under our arms, and we don't check the law book on every transaction that we conduct, do we? Because we know what's right and what's wrong. We know how we must operate if we want to operate a successful business. Because if we want a successful business, we must be honest, we must have integrity, we must understand what truth is, and we must go by that. Most of our countrymen never pick up a law book. How in the world does a system function without the people picking up a law book? It functions very well if they stay away from the law books, I'll tell you that. We have too many law books being put into place in this country by a legal profession that is trying to make a living off of the rest of us. Now, here we are here at this position. Now, we went to the polls on election day, and we cast our ballots. And of course, we get to elect a president, we get to elect our House member, our senators, and of course, the president, of course, appoints our federal judges. Now, I'm talking about the federal level. I'm not talking about county or state or city. I'm talking about the national government here and the way the system was designed to function. You will see that the Constitution is here. The Constitution is the creator of this down here, this government. We the people are the creators of the Constitution. The Constitution is the creator of the legislative branch of government. You read Article 1 of that Constitution and you'll discover that the Constitution created the legislative branch of government with a separate power. These people were given the power to create legislation. A separate power. You go to Article 2 of the Constitution, and you have the executive branch of government that was created by the law that you find in Article 2. And they were given a separate power, which was to administrate. They weren't given any power to legislate. These people had the exclusive power to legislate. Over here, the judicial branch of government, Article 3 of the Constitution is the law that was written, designed to create the judicial branch of government. And so, these three branches of government, each one of them was given a separate power. They were to be a check one against the other. In the government school, they taught us that we don't have anything to worry about with government, because the executive branch of government was to be a check against the legislative and the judicial branch of government. The legislative branch was to be a check against the executive and against the judiciary. And the judicial branch of government was to be a check against the legislative and executive branch. And they said those checks will work and we don't have anything to worry about. We have a lot to worry about today, don't we? We have a lot to worry about because we trusted government. We trusted our tax-consuming public servants with the power to tax us without our consent. We had a war of independence back there, and in those government schools, when I went to school, they said that the war of independence came about because of taxation without representation. You say, well, we are electing our congressmen and our senators. But I say, yes, we elect them, but then they violate their campaign promises. What we have back in the Congress in Washington, D.C. and in the White House are a bunch of vote thieves. Because if you have a candidate that promises to balance the budget, if you have candidates that promise less taxes, if you have candidates that promise more efficient, less corruption, and all of that, and if you vote for them and they go back to Washington, D.C., and you end up with larger deficits, if you end up with more corruption, if you end up with higher taxes, your vote was stolen on election day. Now, it doesn't stop there. You see, we have those politicians, those political appointees in the Justice Department, U.S. attorneys and such. We have them stealing your vote. They steal your vote on the grand jury because they don't tell you what your powers are. They don't tell you that this is your number 2 vote in our system. They don't tell you that you can investigate the crimes committed by IRS agents. They don't tell you that you should prosecute, you should investigate and have IRS agents charged with murder if somebody goes out and commits suicide because of an unlawful, unwarranted assessment against the individual. The U.S. attorney, he wants to steal your vote on the grand jury. He wants to steal your vote on the trial jury because he doesn't want to tell you the truth. And when that happens, here we are, the government is out here, a monster, a terror, a terrorist organization rather than a government of, by, and for the people. As I said earlier, a lot of Americans are coming to the point where they have suffered enough. the Declaration of Independence, I like to repeat that phrase. All experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable. We have been suffering in this country because we have been depending upon the checks and balances to be performed down here between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government. We were trusting those people to be checks, one against the other. And of course, it has failed. Our trust has been betrayed. Our faith in government has been really tested. And at this point in time, our government is running on empty in its credibility tank. There's no credibility left in the government. They have lied to us, they have stolen from us, they have violated us in all kinds of ways. They've done all kinds of mischief. And so the government has no credibility left. And the people out here are struggling, trying to understand what they can do to change the system. And of course, sad to say, most Americans are out here saying, well, where can we find a presidential candidate that we can elect to the presidency, and that candidate will straighten out the mess? Well, I have news for you. You are not going to find a candidate that you can elect to the presidency that will straighten out the mess unless that candidate will teach you what I am about to bring to your attention at this point in time. I am going to explain to you how that there are two more separate powers in our system, in our lawful system. In the democracy, we just have the three powers acting as checks against the other to bring about a balance. They haven't brought the balance. So when we go back and read our history and discover how the founders put the system together, we find that there are two more separate powers that are just fantastic powers, and they're the most powerful separate powers in the entire system. And of course, I talked about the grand jury and the trial jury over here, but I did not bring out how that the grand jury and the trial jury, what they are separate powers, and that they have the authority to be a check against the government. They have a check against that. They're a check against that monster. But I'm going to concentrate on this chart over here for this segment of this TV production. Now, the grand jury goes over here. The trial jury goes over here. Now, if you will remember the schematic that we had here on the difference between a democracy and a republic, the people were up above the Constitution, and that's the way it is here. Well, the grand jury is a separate power above the Constitution. The president, the congressmen, the senators, the judiciary, the judges, all of those hundreds of federal judges in this country, they're all below the Constitution. The grand jury is above the Constitution. The petit jury, the trial jury, they are above the Constitution. Why? Because it is made up of we the people up here. They're the ones who serve on grand juries, they're the ones who serve on trial juries, and they are the creators of the Constitution. So they're not going to put themselves below the Constitution. Now, if we the people up here, if we don't know about our authority, if we do not understand our proper position in this order of authority, this pecking order, then the grand jury is down here on the floor someplace. It isn't even on the picture here. The grand jury is down there on the floor. That's where it's functioning today. This is not what we have today in this nation. The grand jury isn't up here. Although in Montana back in the decade of the 80s, we had 4 years out of the 10 years of the 80s where the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Justice Department in Montana, was unable to get a grand jury indictment of anyone for tax evasion. Why? Very simple, because we went on television and we taught the people of Montana about their power on grand juries and the trial juries. And it was very, very effective. And this video that is being produced right now is going to be very, very effective, because we're going to go right into the living room of Joe Sixpack, and he, for the first time in his life, he's going to understand that he is in a position here where he can be a check. Why is the grand jury a separate power? Very simple. You take all of the people in the executive branch of government. I understand there are over 20 million people now who work for the federal government in one way or another, and most of them are in the executive branch, the administrative branch of government. You take all of those millions of public servants. You take all of the congressmen. There's 435 congressmen. There's 100 U.S. senators. Take all of their staff. Put them all together with all of those judges on the federal bench at the district court level, the appellate level, and the U.S. Supreme Court. You can take all of that conglomeration of government, put them all together, and you cannot find the power. They don't have the authority to indict anybody. What is an indictment? They didn't teach you that in the government school because they didn't want you to know. In the Declaration of Independence, again, it says, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Deriving their just powers. Where do they get their unjust powers? They get their unjust powers also from the consent of the governed, but they are getting unjust powers from a misinformed or disinformed public out there. The people are not informed, and so they are giving their consent. We have grand juries that are not functioning up here where they belong. They're down here because they don't know their authority. Now, suppose that we have one of us, one of our countrymen here. He is a very productive American. He's a small businessman, perhaps. He's got a machine shop or something. He's a craftsman. He takes great pride in being a productive American. And I want you to pay particular attention to the fact that the IRS, they never harass the unproductive. It is only the productive in this country who are being harassed. And the productive, you see, are a minority. You see, you've got all of these government servants down here. You have all of the welfare. You have all of the people that are getting a government check, and there's over 50%, they tell us, that now get some kind of a government subsidy or whatever. The productive individual is a minority. You are not going to be able to control anything with your vote on election day if you're a productive American. It is not going to happen. So, we have a productive individual, and he's up here. He's one of us. And he, at some point, decides that he has suffered enough. He says, every April 15th, I have to write a check to the Internal Revenue Service, which is nothing more than a fine, a penalty for being a productive American. And he says, I've had enough. I've seen all of this waste. I have seen in my local newspaper about the Air Force buying $2,000 toilet seats and $5,000 coffee makers, $350 hammers that he can buy at the hardware store for 10 bucks. He says, I just can't afford this kind of government anymore. And he quits filing. He gets himself informed. He gets himself a soapbox, and he gets up on the soapbox and he tells his fellow Americans, say, hey, we have a criminal government. It goes for 4 or 5 years, and he becomes more active. He's doing the radio talk shows. He's writing letters to the editor. He's passing out pamphlets and books. And he gets the attention of the Internal Revenue Service, and they're down here in the executive branch of government. They say, man, we've got to silence this fellow up here. I call him Mr. A. He's a grade A American, and he's up here, and he's speaking out, which is his right and his duty. He's speaking out. The IRS, they go to the U.S. Attorney's Office, who is also down here in this executive branch of government, and they decide that they want to prosecute Mr. A, but they cannot prosecute Mr. A without the consent of the governed. So they have to come up to the grand jury and get the consent of our representatives on the grand jury. They're supposed to be representing us, not the IRS, not the government. They're supposed to be representing us. Now, when your state legislature, when the Congress, when they pass rules and regulations, say your state legislature, they create traffic laws. What do? Do they just write them in the book and forget them? No. When they write a rule or a statute, they send out their employees. They send out the highway patrol, don't they, to enforce the statutes that they create, the speed limits and all the rest, right? Now, whenever they write law, they send out enforcement people. When we, the people, wrote a law, the Constitution, who did we send out there to enforce the law we wrote? That's what these people are there for. They're our special law enforcement people, our special law enforcement representatives. They're on that grand jury. And they're supposed to be enforcing the Constitution for the United States of America and making these people down here comply with the law that was written to govern them. Very, very simple when you recognize that we are up here above the Constitution, the grand jury's above it, and these people are there to be law enforcement people, not a rubber stamp in the hands of the Justice Department or a federal judge. These people here, when they come up here to ask for an indictment against Mr. A, they listen to the evidence, and then they tell the U.S. Attorney and the IRS, they say, now you go back to your office, servants. They need to exercise their authority. They need to make sure that that U.S. Attorney and the IRS understand that they are the boss. The U.S. Attorney and the IRS, they're public servants. And so they dismiss them. Now, they say, do we want to indict Mr. A? Well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to check out the IRS code. Now, that's down here, because it was created by our public servants, right? So the case and the statute law, it's all down here at the bottom, because these people are the creators of it. So it's down here. And so they say, is the IRS code, is it in compliance with the Constitution for the United States of America? Well, you have some informed people on that grand jury because they're up here. And so one of the people on the grand jury says, well, you know, he says, I have a real serious problem because Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution here, it says the Congress, these people here, that they shall have the power to lay and collect taxes. This grand jury person says, I have a real serious problem with that because Article 1, Section 8 says that the Congress shall collect the taxes, and I find that the IRS is over here in the executive branch of government. This seems like a clear violation of the Constitution for the United States of America. So the grand jury, they discuss that and they say, you know, that makes sense. The Congress, they're the ones that spend the money. And the founders, they figured that out. They said, if the Congress spends the money, then they should be the ones who have to collect it. The Internal Revenue Service office should be a part of your local congressman's office. Your congressman and the IRS, their offices should be in the same building right together. So that if you have a problem with a particular IRS agent, you just tell that IRS agent, say, well, I'm going to go talk to my congressman. So you go over across the aisle and you talk to a staff member over there that is in the staff of the congressman, and you say, staff member, come with me. We have a public servant over here that is completely out of hand, and I want you to make a correction over here. How long would these people, how many times would these people be reelected to the Congress if the Internal Revenue collection was done right out of their office back home? I can assure you they wouldn't be reelected if the IRS was operating the way they do today. They'd have to be pretty nice guys, wouldn't they? The founders had a lot of good common sense. So the grand jury, they say, well, that's enough right there. We don't need anything more. We can call back the U.S. Attorney and say, Mr. U.S. Attorney, we are not going to indict Mr. Ray because this law you've got down here, we're gonna say your law is of no effect until you people down here comply with the Constitution. We want you to come under that Constitution where you belong. We want you to get the IRS out of the executive branch of government and back over here into the legislative branch of government as per Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution. Now, they may want to go a little farther. Now, there's a lot of problems here with the IRS code. They say, well, the Fifth Amendment says that you have to have they got to give you due process. The Fifth Amendment says that you can, you have the right to get proper, I can't think of the proper term right at the moment, but you have the right to be compensated. The Fifth Amendment was put there by we the people to protect us from government. These people, they say, well, the Fourth Amendment, they say the IRS manual says that every IRS audit is an illegal search and seizure under the Fourth Amendment. They say this lower law has to be trash canned because it is in violation of the Constitution. And they can go a little farther. They say, well, let's take a look at the higher laws up here. How about the laws of grammar? Well, you already know that we have a violation there because the IRS code says we have a voluntary tax system, right? And they're trying to prosecute. They want to send Mr. A to jail for not volunteering. So they say, well, we've got a problem there. Well, then the laws of common sense. Common sense tells us that if you take too much away from Mr. A and the other productive people in this country, if you take too much of their production away from them, what happens? They quit producing. Common sense tells you that, doesn't it? Now, if the IRS code was in compliance with the Constitution, if the IRS code was in compliance with the laws of grammar, if for no other reason than the fact that their common sense tells them that it is inhibiting, it is restricting productivity in this country, they can refuse to indict Mr. A for no other reason. How about God's law? God says you return to him 10% of your production and he'll take care of the whole mess. He'll take care of all of it. And the founders, they had a war of independence when King George took 14%. And the grand jury says, this government down here has violated our trust. They're taxing our kids and our unborn generations to come before they're ever old enough to vote. That's taxation without representation. They say, we are not going to indict Mr. A because we're going to protect Mr. A. We're going to enforce the Constitution. We're going to enforce these higher laws. this lower law is not in compliance with the higher laws. Suppose you have a grand jury that is not functioning properly, a grand jury that is not a check. You see, that grand jury that will refuse to indict Mr. A, that grand jury that refuses to indict Mr. A is being a check against the President of the United States and the administrative branch of government. That grand jury that refuses to indict is a check against a Congress that is made up of vote thieves. That grand jury will be a check against a judiciary. The arrogance of the federal judiciary today must be checked. We must check them. And this is the vote that we use to do it. Now, if your grand jury is down there on the floor, being nothing but a rubber stamp for public servants down here, that grand jury will indict Mr. A, and then he has to go to trial over here in a criminal trial in federal court. And it is happening hundreds of times across this nation. And Mr. A is not going to be able to present the evidence that he needs to defend himself with, because this judge, that judge is going to look out for the interests of government. And the best interests of government say that that jury must not be allowed to hear the truth. They must not be allowed to hear the truth, because if they hear the truth in that courtroom, they are going to rule against the government. Every decision that we have seen come out of the Congress, out of the executive branch, out of the judiciary in the last 50 years, almost without exception, has been in favor of government and against the people of this nation. It has been a downhill slide because we, the people, have not been exercising our power on these grand juries and on the trial jury. Now, here is the beauty of what I have been trying to teach you today. If that grand jury does not function, and if they indict Mr. A, he goes to trial in that courtroom, and if we can reach just one person out of every 20 in this country with this message, I'm not talking about meeting or reaching a majority of the people like a democracy, where we have to try to change the people, the faces in the Congress or in the Senate and in the White House. No, we can do it with just 5% of our fellow Americans, our countrymen, understanding the principles that I am talking about here at this point in time. Because all we need on this jury over here, this petit jury, is just one informed American. And it's a strange thing about that one informed American. They've got a stronger backbone. They've got a harder head. And not only that, but they have a concern for their country and their countrymen, and they will carry that over into the deliberations in that deliberation room after they take the case and go back to come to their decision. Back in 1980, in February of 1980, we had a trial in Great Falls, Montana. The IRS had managed to get an indictment against a farmer. They had him with 3 felony counts being tried for tax evasion. They had set this man up like a pigeon. He didn't have a chance. They had all of his records. They had gone to great extremes to set up a case that was just absolutely airtight for them. They went through that trial, and the jury took that case about 3 o'clock of an afternoon. They deliberated until late in the evening. I had not been able to attend the trial. I was 220 or 30 miles away, and I was staying very close to my telephone, waiting for the news. The IRS, during the trial, during the evidence, had admitted that they had tried to make this farmer commit suicide. I had spent about 2 hours with this man in the restaurant of the Holiday Inn in Great Falls, Montana one day, explaining to him why he dared not to commit suicide. If it hadn't been for his friends and his family, his neighbors just literally hanging on to him, there would not have been a trial. The IRS would have ended up with everything that he had, including his farm. That's what they wanted. And that jury went out, and I didn't hear anything. That jury deliberated late into the evening, and then they came back the next day and all day long. And I stayed close to my phone. I knew. We had been running those television across the state of Montana explaining basically what I'm explaining to you today. About 5 o'clock, I got that phone call. The jury just came out. Not guilty on all 3 counts. The young prosecutor threw a tantrum in the courtroom. He said, "How could you come out with such a verdict?" Well, we found out. The first vote in the jury room was 11-1 for conviction. A little gray-haired grandmother had voted not guilty. I can just visualize those other 11 on the jury turning to that little gray-haired grandmother and saying, "Lady, what in the world is the matter with you? This guy violated the law." He had violated the lower law. But it just so happens this lower law is not good law. It is not valid law. It is law that needs to be trash canned. And that little gray-haired grandmother, she started talking. And right away, one of the other ladies on the jury said, "Yeah, I heard about that. I heard about that." And so the next vote was 10-2. And when that jury came out, it was 12 votes not guilty on all counts. We don't have to have this absolutely impossible majority that it takes to control the Congress to get rid of that bad law. We don't need a majority to elect a president who will sign a law that eliminates the Internal Revenue Service and the graduated income tax. We don't need that. We don't need to change all the faces on the federal bench. All we have to do is educate our fellow countrymen to where we can have that 1 out of 20, because you see 65% of our fellow Americans aren't even registered to vote. They've given up on the system. And then you've got all these people that don't want to serve on the jury. They'll make all kinds of excuses. But you see, the individual who has the information is not going to try to get off of that jury. He's not going to make excuses. That individual who has the information is going to put on a blank face. He's going to go into that courtroom determined to get on that jury. He is not going to say anything or do anything that would jeopardize his opportunity to be on that jury. Here about 3 years ago, we had a very critical case. The government wanted to prosecute a very high-profile tax protester. They had him charged with about 8 different indictments. That trial went on for several days. Then it went to the jury, and the jury went through a day of deliberations. Then they went through another day. Then they went through another day, and they finally came out not guilty on all counts. We found out we had a retired military man who came to that courthouse on that trial date. He was noticed that he was to be on the jury panel, and he said, "I was determined to get on that jury." And he was able to get on that jury. And he informed the other 11, and they came out not guilty on all counts. This is what we need to see in this country. This is what we're going to have to see in this country if we want to solve the Federal Reserve Bank problem. All of these different problems that are confronting us, the different agencies, OSHA, all the rest of them. This is how we are going to have to do it. And we're going to have to put ourselves up here at that position, in this position where we can use our votes to turn the system around. You've been a very good audience, and I thank you. Back a few years ago, a number of years ago, back about 1976 and 77, we started having meetings in such as this in the Holiday Inn Convention Center back in Billings, Montana, where I come from. And we had run a TV special, and we had a very nice crowd that showed up the next night at a meeting there in that convention center. We had about 450 people. And of course, I was teaching the jury principle and the function of the jury. But that night I got up there and introduced myself to that crowd, and I said something that I thought at the moment was rather funny. I said, I want to welcome all of you IRS agents that are here. At that point in time, we had IRS agents that attended most of our meetings. And I said, I want to welcome all you IRS agents that are here. And of course, today, right here now, if we have an IRS agent here, I want to welcome you here. But back there, I made a mistake. I said, I'm glad to have you here, but we can't guarantee your safety. There were about 450 people there, and there were 3 fellows in the audience that jumped up like they'd set on attack or something and ran out the door. Everybody laughed. I mean, those fellows gave themselves away. I like to have IRS agents in our audiences, and I like to have U.S. attorneys, and I don't know if I've ever had a federal judge, but I would hope so. I do know that we ran a 1-hour TV special back in New Hampshire. It cost me $7,000 to run that 1-hour TV special in Manchester, New Hampshire, back in about February of 1984. We ran that program, a 1-hour TV special, and we titled it Hope for America. We didn't get too much response from that program, but I got one letter that made it all worthwhile. I got a letter from one of the justices of the Supreme Court for the state of New Hampshire on the Supreme Court stationery. And he said this, he says, I watched your TV special, and he said, I want you to know that I agree that you are 100% right in what you're saying. That made it all worthwhile. You see, that $7,000 I was investing in my country. I wasn't investing in a criminal government. I was investing in my country because I am convinced that my grandchildren will get a much better return on that kind of an investment than if I were to have bought stocks or bonds or whatever and pass those on to my heirs when I die. I am interested in making an investment that will pay off in the future. And I do not believe that I can invest any better than investing in the process of informing my fellow Americans. Now, I have some questions here that you folks have put out here. You've been writing these in the last hour, hour and a half, and I am not going to be able to address them all. But I'm going to address the ones that I think are most important and the ones that will go with what I have been saying here today. The first question is this: can you explain how the grand jury is seated? Who picks the members? That is a very good question, a very vital question. We know that we have a criminal system out there in the Justice Department and the federal judges. They are manipulating the thing at times. We know that. We have a question in here telling about how the U.S. Attorney fired the foreman of a grand jury here in this area because apparently he was not working with the U.S. Attorney. He was working for the country rather than for the government. That question is in here too.
but I want to address this, how the grand jury is supposedly, or it is supposed to be picked. The federal grand jury is to be picked from the voter registration list, the same process as they use to pick the juries for the petit juries, the criminal trials, the civil trials. They're supposed to pick them by lot. However, we know in some places in this country they have manipulated this, and in other places they have followed the law. In Montana, back about 1979 or 80, I was talking to the U.S. attorney, and he told me, he said, Red, he says, we have held the last federal grand jury over an additional 6 months because we were afraid we would get a tax protester on the next grand jury. That's one of the things that they are doing. That kind of mischief will continue until we get grand juries informed, people on those grand juries, like the grand jury foreman that was fired here by the U.S. attorney. If the rest of that grand jury had been functioning properly, they would have immediately called in the U.S. attorney. When the U.S. attorney tried to fire the foreman, the rest of the grand jury should have immediately called in the U.S. attorney, put him under oath, and questioned him as to his authority. Where did he get the authority to fire the foreman of the grand jury? You know what would have happened if they had been informed and known? The U.S. attorney would have been charged with the felony. You see, he doesn't have that authority. You remember now? Where is the authority? Is it above? Yes. It is above the U.S. attorney. The grand jury has the authority, not the U.S. attorney. We had a federal grand jury in Salt Lake that handed down some indictments against the Federal Reserve Bank system back a few years ago. They did not understand their position properly. When the U.S. attorney dismissed their first indictment, they should have indicted the U.S. attorney. Obstruction of justice. When the judge dismissed their second indictment, they should have indicted him. The grand jury's up here, the judge is down here. What does that mean? It's just like the grand jury here, they're bird colonels in the military. And the judge is some kind of a corporal or a sergeant down here. Now, who has control? Who is in command? If you are in the military and if you had a corporal with an IQ of 80, and I think most of us have seen a few of them, if you had a corporal with an IQ of 80 and you had 1,000,000 privates and all of them had an IQ averaging 130, who would be in command? Not the smartest ones, not the million out there, the majority, no. Because there is an order of authority, there is a chain of command in the military. And it is there so that there is a discipline in the system. And that corporal with his 80 IQ is in command. I know we have former military people here, and you understand exactly what I'm saying. The grand jury is up here. They should not be taking any guff off of these people down here. Back several years ago, they had a special grand jury impaneled in Salt Lake City, Utah, and they had 7 notorious high-profile tax protesters from the West. I was not one of them, that they had targeted. And they spent tax dollars like they were going out of style. They subpoenaed witnesses from all over the United States. A young fellow came out to my house. He said, I've got this subpoena. I have to go to Salt Lake and appear before the grand jury. He was, he was at a loss. He was frightened. He was intimidated. He didn't know what to expect. And so I sat him down and explained the facts of life to him. I said, They don't want you. They're after somebody else. I knew about that grand jury. I knew what was happening. They were bringing in all these people, flying them into Salt Lake, putting them up in the hotels, and they were feeding them and everything else and flying them back home. I said, you don't have any answers to any questions that they're looking for. They're going to ask you a couple of questions, and then they're going to release you and fly you back to Billings, Montana. I said, you have nothing to worry about as far as you being a target. You're not a target. They want to see if you've got some evidence they can use against these high-profile tax protesters out here. So I sat him down and I explained a few things to him. I used the tax audit guide. I showed him the forward by the commissioner of the IRS. I showed him the section about the tax or the books and records of the individual, and how that an audit is an illegal search and seizure. It violates the Fifth Amendment. You have to waive your Fifth Amendment rights if you're going to file a 1040. I explained all this, and of course, this was 1984. We had all of the file on the 16th Amendment fraud that had been put together by the farmers, ranchers, and business people up in Montana that called themselves the Montana Historians. I had that file, and I showed him the legislative journals for several of the states and how that they had not ratified the 16th Amendment, the income tax. And then I gave him the file. I gave him copies of my book, Born Again Republic, the one do unto the IRS as they would do unto you, Church Deceived. I gave him copies of all of this, that tax audit guide. I said, you go into that grand jury hearing and take all of this material with you. They're only going to ask you a couple of questions, and then they're going to try to hustle you right out because they've got all these people there waiting to testify. And I said, please, at some point, I said, you've got to play it by ear. At some point, you say, wait a minute. I would like to talk to this grand jury in private without the U.S. attorney, without the prosecutor here. I didn't know if this young fellow, I think he was about 26 or 7 years old, and he didn't know anything really. He didn't know very much. I didn't know if he would do it. I was afraid he'd go in there just shaking in his boots. But you know, he went in there and they asked him 2 questions and they were going to hustle him out. And he said, wait a minute. I'd like to talk to this grand jury in private without the U.S. attorney in here. And the U.S. attorney was caught completely off guard. Hey, well, that's up to the foreman of the grand jury. And the foreman of the grand jury said, yes, we would like to talk to you. And he took about 10 to 15 minutes and he went into that tax audit guide. He showed them what the tax audit guide had to say. He showed them the file on the 16th Amendment material and how that there was a fraud perpetrated against the American people. And then he said, now, if you would like to have all of this material, I will give it to you. And they were so glad to get that material. And he went out the door and came back to Montana. That grand jury deliberated for an entire year and did not return one single indictment. We're confident they spent millions because they wanted to just absolutely devastate the tax protest leadership in the West. And there was a grand jury that protected those people. Why and how? Very simple. They were able to get some truth. They were able to get some information that allowed them to function the way they're supposed to function. I better go on with these questions. Serving on the grand jury is a full-time job. 1 year, every day, 9 to 5. He says, I would love to serve, but I have to make a living. First of all, they pay you to serve on that grand jury, but in most cases, it is not a 9 to 5 everyday type of situation. In Los Angeles, with all the crime you have, it probably is. However, I believe that no matter what the sacrifice is, and if anyone in the patriot community is called for grand jury duty, I would hope that the rest of the patriot community would jump in there and take up the slack and support this individual financially, if at all possible, to make sure that this individual can serve on that grand jury, because that grand jury juror member has the opportunity to educate his fellow jurors, grand jurors. Just a week ago, last Saturday, I was in Des Moines, Iowa for a meeting, and they had a speaker there that had just been on a federal grand jury in Milwaukee, Wisconsin for 18 months. And he, excuse me, he was rather proud of the fact that at the end of their 12 months, the U.S. Attorney wanted them to serve an additional 6 months. And it was really kind of painful to have to tell him that the reason that the U.S. Attorney wanted them to serve an extra 6 months was because it was a rubber stamp grand jury. They like rubber stamps. And that grand jury had been so willing to serve the U.S. Attorney down here. That grand jury, they weren't up here. That grand jury was down here. If you've got a grand jury up here, I can assure you that the U.S. Attorney is not going to ask you to serve another 6 months. And so it was kind of painful to kind of communicate with, I had to be very diplomatic and communicate with this fellow and say, hey, the reason they wanted you another 6 months was because you were doing everything they told you. You were a bunch of puppets on the strings, and the strings were controlled by the U.S. Attorney. Can a juryman vote against the law? That's not the right term. Now, one of the terms that is used is jury nullification. That's not really the best term either. Now, we talked about the legislative branch of government having the authority, the power, the exclusive, separate power to legislate. They create legislation, and it goes to the president, and it does not become law until the president signs it. If the president does not agree with the legislative branch of government, he has veto power. Veto power. The legislative branch of government then, if they can muster enough votes, they can override the veto and it will become law. Now, what I'm talking about here is that system of checks and balances. The president is to be a check against the legislative branch of government. He is to use his power of signing a bill or legislation that he is to use his veto power as a check against the legislative branch of government. They, in turn, the legislative branch, they can use their power to override the veto as a check against the president. And then, of course, after the president, if he signs a bill or the Congress overrides a veto, then the courts will usually get a crack at it to say whether it is constitutional or unconstitutional. The grand jury, by refusing to indict, by refusing to enforce this lower law, they have literally vetoed that law in that particular case. Now, the president, when he vetoes it, it has great coverage and it covers the entire law. In the grand jury's case, it is only pertaining to that one case that is before them. So, you have a situation here where the law, in some cases, might be proper. But you may have a law here that the U.S. Attorney, he has a vendetta against somebody, and he's trying to use the law down here to punish somebody. And the grand jury, they see through that, and they say, no, we're not going to indict, because that's not a proper application of the law. The big thing, however, for this grand jury is to recognize they're supposed to judge the law, this lower law created by the legislative branch, signed by the president, adjudicated to be constitutional. That is lower law. Their responsibility is to examine that law carefully and judge that law. Put the law on trial. The difference between a free society and an authoritarian type of government is the people in a free society must retain the right to judge the law. Where they don't have the right to judge the law, you will have the authoritarian, the dictatorship type of government. In this nation, the judges, the congressmen, the president are not going to tell you that you have the right to judge the law. That's your job and mine, is to reach our countrymen with that information, the fact that we have the right to judge the law. Another question, what is common law? There is considerable confusion about common law. There are two very well-defined kinds of common law. One is called English common law. The other is called Anglo-Saxon common law. And they are directly opposite of each other. If you will look in your volume 1 of your revised codes of the state of California, I believe every single state has the same clause. Volume 1, right very nearly to the beginning of the book, you will see this. It'll read like this. It'll say, if a controversy arises not covered by the statutes of your state, you revert back to the English common law. The English common law says that the people are down here and that the government is free. The English common law says that the government has the authority. The Anglo-Saxon common law, that's where your grand juries and your trial juries came into being. The Anglo-Saxon common law says that the people, that they are sovereign, and that the king or the government is subject to the people. Now that's quite a difference, isn't it? Remember I said there's only two kinds of government? You have government controlled by people or people controlled by government. That's the only kind. I don't care what kind of a label you put on it, democracy, Nazism, socialism, communism, or whatever. You see, it doesn't make any difference if you are executed by a bullet in the back of the head. It doesn't make one bit of difference to you. You're dead. It isn't going to make any difference whether that bullet says democracy. That's what happened to Vicki Weaver up in northern Idaho. That was a democracy. And her son Sammy shot in the back. That bullet said democracy on it. Those people down there in Waco, all those little kids murdered. It had democracy written all over that atrocity. It could have had communist label on it. It doesn't make any difference. Waco happened because we the people lost control of our government. Common law. I talk about the laws of common sense. Every individual out there, if they have normal mental capacity, has it right between their heads, right between their ears. It's there. Why? Because your God creator put it there. Your mother at your mother's knee should have been teaching you the difference between right and wrong. They should be teaching you right from wrong in the schools, but that's why we have problems in our schools today, because they say, oh, we can't teach these values. The government schools have to go. The laws of common sense, those are laws that we have readily available, and we function under those laws every day of our lives. Here's the one about the district attorney fired the head of the grand jury, and I've already touched on that. Here's one that's kind of close to my heart. How can your research into the improper ratification of the 16th Amendment gain judicial notice? It was in 1980, June of 1980. I was talking on the phone late at night with a fellow up in Montana who had become very active because of our television specials. And we were talking and discussing things, and of course I was using, way back then, I was challenging audiences to tell me one time where our tax-consuming public servants had told us the truth on any major story in this century. I've recited that long list of lies many, many times, even on national television. We've been on satellite television before. They lied about Pearl Harbor, Korea, Vietnam, Social Security, energy shortage, Watergate, Kennedy assassination, and on and on and on. And this fellow says, you don't suppose they lied to us about the ratification of the 16th Amendment? That is the amendment that supposedly gave the Congress the power to lay a tax on our incomes. I said, Sam, we have to know. From their track record, we have to understand, we have to know that it is a fraud. He said, we better get the evidence. We better collect the research. We better research this. We better collect the evidence. We better get the legislative journals from the 48 states that we had in 1913. And so that was the birth of an ad hoc type of group of people that said, we're going to do research. We're going to collect the evidence of criminal activity by our public servants. And they started to gather up all of these legislative documents, the arguments, the debates, I should say, and the votes of the various state legislatures. By the time I wrote my book, Born Again Republic, in 1981, we knew that the 16th Amendment had not been ratified. The evidence had not been completed until January of '83. And when I took it into federal court the first time in March of '83, they refused to accept it because they said it was not certified. So Mr. Bill Benson from South Holland, in the Chicago area, South Holland, Illinois, he went out and went to all of the 48 states. Judge Moody in federal court in June of 1980, I testified, and he said, you've got to have a witness that'll testify that he's gone to all the states and gathered all this information. They put up a bunch of hoops for us to jump through, and we jumped through every single one, and it cost us about $100 grand to do it. But when Bill Benson completed the journey, the sojourn across the United States, we had over 17,000 certified documents. We put this book together, Volume 1, The Law That Never Was. Back there about 1987, every single congressman, every senator was given a copy of this book with their name gold embossed on the cover. This is a beautiful book. I'm not one bit ashamed of it, I'll tell you that. We are not going to get this evidence out here and make it work until we can get a grand jury in this country that will take this evidence and start indicting federal judges for violation of their oath. They're violating Title 18, Section 4, misprision of felony. They're violating it every day in this country. Bill completed that evidence in Christmas Eve of 1984. We had this book out in April of 1985. And we have been confronting the courts across this land, the U.S. attorneys and the federal judges since that time. And at this point in time, I am absolutely convinced that every federal judge and U.S. attorney in this country is guilty of a felony. It will not be corrected until we have our grand juries start investigating, researching, and then indicting these people for violations of the supreme law and the laws of our land. This is why we must inform our fellow Americans with the truth that I have brought to you at this time. Thank you, and go out and let's do the job.